"Sir, you can't be here." Those were the words that stopped Daniel Harper in his own driveway. The flashing red and blue lights behind the police car reflected off the quiet suburban street as Daniel stood there, keys still in his hand, staring at the officer in confusion. "This is my house," Daniel said slowly. The officer glanced down at his notes. "We received a call from the homeowners association next door reporting a trespasser." A trespasser? Daniel looked at the house behind him, the same house he had just bought 2 weeks earlier. The same house that had been listed clearly in the real estate documents as non-HOA property, yet somehow, the neighborhood next door believed he didn't belong here. And that wasn't even the strangest part, because the person who called the police was standing across the street watching the scene unfold, a woman in a red blazer with a clipboard tucked under her arm, Karen Whitfield, president of the neighboring HOA. She crossed the street with the confident stride of someone who believed the rules were on her side. "Officer," she said calmly, pointing toward Daniel, "that man has been repeatedly entering HOA property." Daniel blinked in disbelief. "This driveway is part of my lot," he replied. Karen simply shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "This entire section of land belongs to the association." Daniel felt a strange chill run through him. Because according to every document he had signed, that wasn't true, and what Karen didn't realize was that the truth about this property was hidden in a survey map she had clearly never seen, a map that would soon change everything. But first, Daniel had to prove he wasn't trespassing on his own land. Daniel Harper hadn't planned to buy a house next to an HOA. In fact, avoiding one had been his top priority. After years of hearing stories about strict rules, endless fees, and neighborhood disputes, he wanted something simpler: freedom. That's why the small 2-story house at the edge of Maple Ridge caught his attention. The property listing made it very clear: no HOA restrictions. The realtor even confirmed it during the showing. "The HOA boundary ends right behind this fence," she explained. For Daniel, that detail sealed the deal. He signed the papers, closed on the house, and moved in with a sense of relief. For the first week, everything seemed normal, until the first letter appeared. It arrived in a plain envelope placed under his front door. Inside was a printed notice titled, "HOA Violation Warning." Daniel had laughed when he first read it. It claimed his driveway, mailbox, and even his backyard landscaping violated HOA guidelines. But the notice made no sense. His house wasn't part of the association, at least. That's what the documents said. Daniel assumed someone had made a mistake, so he ignored the letter. 2 days later, the second notice arrived. This one was different. It warned that further violations could result in legal enforcement. Daniel still didn't worry, because according to every official record he had seen, the HOA had no authority over his property. But what he didn't realize was that Karen Whitfield believed something completely different, and she was about to take things much further than a warning letter. The police officer listened patiently as both sides explained their version of the situation. Karen spoke first. "This entire cul-de-sac is HOA property," she insisted. "The association maintains the road, the landscaping, everything." She pointed directly at Daniel's driveway. "He's been using private HOA access." Daniel almost laughed at the absurdity of the claim. "This road is listed as a public easement," he replied calmly. Karen shook her head. "That's incorrect." The officer looked back and forth between them. "Do either of you have documentation?" he asked. Karen immediately lifted her clipboard. Daniel simply smiled, because unlike Karen, he hadn't brought papers with him. They were inside the house. More specifically, they were stored in a folder labeled Property Survey, and that folder contained something Karen clearly didn't know existed. Daniel excused himself for a moment and walked inside. The officer waited. Karen folded her arms confidently. From her perspective, the situation was simple. The HOA controlled the neighborhood, and Daniel had refused to follow the rules. But when Daniel returned with the folded survey map, the entire conversation shifted, because the moment the officer unfolded the document, something unexpected became very clear. The boundary line didn't stop where Karen thought it did. In fact, it didn't even come close. The survey map spread across the hood of the police car. Daniel pointed to the bold boundary line drawn across the page. "This is my lot," he explained. The officer leaned closer. The map clearly showed the property extending farther than Karen had claimed, farther than the fence, farther than the driveway, and most importantly, beyond the entrance road itself. Karen frowned. "That can't be right," she said quickly. Daniel remained calm. "It's filed with the county." The officer nodded slowly. "If this survey is accurate," he said, "then the road isn't HOA owned." Karen's confident posture began to fade. "But the association has maintained it for years," she argued. "That may be true," the officer replied. "But maintenance doesn't equal ownership." Daniel watched quietly, because he knew something Karen still hadn't realized. the survey didn't just show his property boundaries, it revealed something far more surprising. A section of the road the HOA believed they controlled was actually part of Daniel's land, which meant something extraordinary. For years, the HOA had been enforcing rules on property they didn't legally own, and if that discovery was correct, the entire neighborhood's understanding of the boundary was about to change. But the biggest shock was still coming, because Daniel had already contacted someone who specialized in land records. And that person had just confirmed something even Karen couldn't deny. 2 days later, the HOA scheduled an emergency meeting. Nearly every seat in the Maple Ridge Community Hall was filled. Word about the boundary dispute had spread quickly. Karen Whitfield opened the meeting with a tense expression. "We're here to clarify a misunderstanding regarding property lines," she announced. Daniel sat quietly in the back of the room. Next to him was a man holding a leather folder. A county land surveyor. When Karen finished speaking, Daniel stood. "With your permission," he said politely, "I'd like to present the official county survey." Karen hesitated but nodded. The surveyor stepped forward and unfolded a large printed map. Gasps rippled through the room. The boundary line was unmistakable. Daniel's property extended farther than anyone expected, including the section of road where the HOA entrance sign stood. For years, residents believed the association owned that area, but the records told a different story. Karen looked stunned. "That sign has been there for 10 years, she said quietly. The surveyor nodded. "That may be true," he replied. "But according to county records, it's on Mr. Harper's land." The room erupted in whispers. Daniel didn't say anything, he simply watched as the realization slowly spread across the crowd. Because the HOA hadn't just accused him of trespassing, they had built their entrance on his property. And that revelation was about to change everything. By the end of the meeting, the tension in the room had completely shifted. Neighbors who once supported the HOA board now looked uncertain. If the entrance sign and part of the road stood on Daniel's land, then the association had made a serious mistake. Karen Whitfield approached Daniel after the meeting. Her confident tone from earlier was gone. "We clearly need to review the records," she said carefully. Daniel nodded. "I agree." But he also knew something important. The county survey wasn't new, it had been filed years before he bought the property, which meant the information had always been available. It simply hadn't been checked. A week later, the HOA issued an official statement to the neighborhood. They acknowledged the boundary error and withdrew the trespassing complaint. But the biggest surprise came next, because the association asked Daniel for permission to keep the entrance sign where it was. Technically, it now sat on his land. Daniel considered the request carefully. He could demand its removal. Legally, he had every right, but instead, he offered a different solution, one that no one in the neighborhood expected. And that decision would become the final twist in the entire story. The following weekend, neighbors gathered near the entrance of Maple Ridge. Daniel stood beside the HOA sign as Karen approached. "We'd like to leave the sign where it is," she said. "If that's possible." Daniel smiled. "It can stay," he replied. Karen looked relieved. "But there's one condition," Daniel added. The small crowd leaned closer. Daniel pointed to the empty space beneath the sign. "If it's on my property," he said calmly, "then I'd like a small addition." The next day, a second plaque appeared under the HOA sign. It read, "Welcome to Maple Ridge HOA neighborhood next door." The message was simple, but it reminded everyone of one important truth: Daniel's home was not part of the HOA. And never had been. From that day forward, the association respected the boundary completely. The letters stopped, the warnings disappeared, and Daniel finally enjoyed the quiet home he had originally hoped for, all because a single survey map revealed a truth no one had expected. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.